All right, everyone, welcome. My name is John Vonkus. I'm one of the partners at CastlePointe, and I want to welcome you to our free lunch webinar series. This series is basically about IT transformation, and we talk on a number of topics: cultural change, organizational effectiveness, driving business value. These are normally 30-minute discussions. Today's discussion has been expanded to 45 minutes because of the amount of content we have. If you're not able to stay for the whole session, it will be recorded and posted to the website. You can go back and listen to it at your leisure. Also want to let you know that sometime next week we'll have a white paper on this topic also available on the website, and we'll send you out an email letting you know when that's available. So they say there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, today there will be. Two of you will basically, on a random drawing, receive $25 gift cards to TGI Fridays, so you will be getting a free lunch. Also wanted to let you know that if you see on the left side of your screen, there's a Q&A area there. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in. We'll try to save some time at the end to circle back and address those questions. With all that said, today's webinar is on measured leadership, basically how putting metrics at the center of your management approach to drive behavioral change. It'll be given by Charlie Araujo. And Charlie, I'll turn it over to you.
John, thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to each of you wherever you happen to be located, either in the country or I know some of you from actually outside of the U.S. So welcome. And I'd like to start today. I'm the president of CastlePointe, and I do just enjoy having these opportunities to talk a little bit about how we see the world of IT and transformation. So I'd like to start a little bit today with an admonition or a warning about what this isn't, I guess, in that, I guess truth in advertising, the term measured leadership is somewhat of a misnomer. When I was growing up, my father had a phrase, even as, believe it or not, as a young child, used to love to tell me that figures lie and liars figure. And his message was really clear, even as a young man there, that leadership is not about numbers. It's not about manipulation. That leadership is all about people. And we need to make sure as we go through, we're going to spend the rest of our time here together today talking about how to look at numbers and how to bring metrics into the center of your organization from a management standpoint. But we need to never lose sight of the fact that if it devolves into only being about the numbers and we forget that it's about the people, then we will lose this battle. So leadership is about people, and we need to keep the figures in their proper perspective. That said, as a leader, your goal and objective should always be to create a vision of where you want to take the organization, set that direction. And the metrics can be the important guideposts to help you on that journey, to help you understand whether or not you are in fact going in the right direction, or how fast or how slow you're moving in that direction, and when you veer off course. And this is actually one of the challenges I think that we see sometimes in IT organizations, is that we don't necessarily look at metrics in the right way. That metrics are not about, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but they're not meant to be window dressing. They are meant to be a very useful set of tools that as an IT leader you can use to steer your ship. And I'm going to use the term IT leader a lot here. And I want you all to recognize that if you're in an IT organization, by my view of it, you're an IT leader. You may be an IT leader of yourself, or you may be the IT leader that runs the entire IT organization. But we all are leaders of how we operate within the context of an IT organization. And so this is relevant to all of us. So if we're looking at this and saying, well, these are tools that we use to steer our ship, then we have a challenge. And that is that in most IT organizations, well, frankly, the IT metrics are somewhat meaningless. Now, I don't want to get flamed on this. I'm not trying to say that the metrics that the IT organizations have, are of no value. But they are somewhat meaningless because they typically lack context. They're viewed as these discrete data points that measure one spot component of how an IT organization operates. And in most cases, that means that they are not actionable. We can't actually take any action off of them, which is why we tend to bring them to meetings, we review them, we nod and we smile, and we move on. Or worse, in my opinion, is that they lead to the wrong action. And I'm going to use one of my favorite examples, first call resolution rate metric. And if any of you are running a service desk, please don't, flame me and blast me all over the place. Because I know this is kind of the holy grail of service desk metrics, but I frankly have a real problem with it to a certain point. And here's why, is that it is meant to describe or to be an indicator that a service desk is both efficient and proficient, that by resolving incidents at that first point of contact with the customer, we are both providing better customer service to them, and we are eliminating incidents from moving through the support cycle up to level 2 or level 3, and where it has to be serviced by much more expensive support resources. Now, I agree with all of that, but it is still a discrete data point by itself. And here's the classic example of that, is that if, in fact, we have a problem management initiative also going on at the same time, and they take an effort to go and eliminate password resets or some other type of problem that is prevalent in the environment, the reality is that those activities are going to actually cause your FCR metric to fall. And if we do not have the necessary context to understand the relationship between these two activities, then there's a very good chance that some senior leader who's looking at this metric in isolation says, well, go fix FCR. Why is it falling all of a sudden? We need it back up. And that can actually lead to the exact opposite actions from what we really desire. It can cause people to not resolve those problems, or it can cause people to not take the most efficient mechanism of resolving that incident because they're trying to keep it to qualify as FCR. So it's not that FCR is bad. It's that we have to be very careful that we understand what a metric is telling us in context. And how do we create context? Well, as we've kind of alluded to here, from our standpoint, it's really all about correlation. It's about understanding the relationships between multiple metrics and the entire model of the metrics. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today. We actually have an entire article out on the website on how to build a metrics correlation model. I would encourage you to go read that, and it kind of steps through the mechanics. But suffice it to say that understanding correlation between your metrics is key. If you look at your metrics in isolation, you will never be able to make them actionable because you can't really understand what is happening. It is a very rare metric that in and of itself can give you enough information to tell you where something is broken, what is actually wrong, and what you actually need to fix. So, as we talk about that, that's great. Context and correlation, critical aspects. You got to, as we're doing the building blocks of a metric strategy, you've got to have it. But it only really matters if those metrics actually get used. And so the question is, how do you start getting people? I mean, I'm willing to bet that most of you that are on this call right now have a bunch of metrics that people look at, they gloss over, and don't actually take any action on. They don't actually do anything with them. And so the question is why? Well, from our estimation or our rationale, the real reason is that they lack emotion. And anytime I say this, people kind of look at me a little funny. It's like, emotion? Wait a minute, I thought we were talking about metrics. Metrics are about cold, hard facts. It's not about emotion. But the reality of it is that emotion creates energy. And you need energy to create action. And so we often misunderstand emotion, particularly when we are talking about metrics or really even IT in general. But we have to start with this fundamental understanding that a metric is only as good as the emotion it evokes. If the metric cannot create or evoke emotion, it will not spur action. And that's because without action, just as human beings, we are ambivalent and we're static. Without emotion. And you can think about your life in any number of different ways, and it's always those things that spur an emotional reaction and an emotional response that cause us to rise up and do something. That's why when we look at nonprofit type activities, they're always looking at how they can tug on that heartstring, because that's what, giving you just cold stats isn't really going to do much unless they can turn that into something that creates an emotional relationship. So emotions are incredibly important because they create that power. Now, how do we create emotion? Well, sometimes you can create emotion merely through correlation. So if I go back to this example of FCR, as a problem manager, I may not have a whole lot of interest in FCR. I look at that and say, well, that's not my area. But if I can show through correlation that the activities that I'm doing through problem now have a direct impact on FCR and someone is paying attention to FCR, then that can create sometimes enough connection for me to now have an interest in that metric and create an emotional connection to it. But not always. Sometimes it can be as simple as comparison. So something we see used to great effect is what we call shining the light of day. Simply exposing these metrics in a very public setting as a means to enable teams to compare themselves to one another. Now, I'm sure you guys probably do some of this today in your organization, but taking a deliberate approach to this can actually create that emotional context. So sometimes it's healthy competition where no one wants to, maybe they aren't interested in being the best, but they don't want to be the laggard. They don't want to be the worst. And so that can create an emotional connection with a metric and cause them to take action. Or it can also be a situation where you're comparing to yourself, where you create almost a game out of it, where we're saying we're going to not just trend our metrics, but actually measure ourselves and reward ourselves based on how we are doing in comparison to how we did last month or whatever it might be. So comparisons can sometimes be a useful tool to create that emotional context. But again, in many cases, it's an afterthought. It needs to be much more deliberate to make that emotional connection. But sometimes we need to connect to something bigger than ourselves to create that connection. Sometimes it is, particularly in situations today that we have in many IT organizations, that we are so focused on what we are doing in this very specialized area that it's easy to lose sight of how that relates to the bigger picture of what the IT organization is doing, and most importantly, how that provides any meaning or value to the organization as a whole. So we have to connect ourselves to a bigger picture. And if we get right down to it, most of us really seek that. Most of us want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. It allows us to connect up with something that maybe we couldn't achieve on our own. And so creating that connection with a bigger picture, a bigger goal, allows us to kind of consume or connect ourselves with that emotional energy. So what is that when we talk about metrics and from an IT perspective? What does that mean? Well, it really means connecting to IT performance as a whole. It means drawing it into how does the IT organization, how is it performing in meeting and delivering business value or value to the business? Because at the end of the day, one of my favorite terms, by the way, at the end of the day, IT performance is really the only reason to ever have a metric. If I can't take a metric and somehow connect it to a business-driven objective that speaks to how IT is performing and delivering value, then I probably don't need this metric to begin with. So we have to make sure that we are understanding everything in the context of the business value that it provides. And we have to recognize that by doing that, by connecting everything we're doing in every metric, no matter how technical or process-oriented, back up to the business value, that it creates energy. We're able to attach ourselves to the energy of that's why we're doing this. And it also allows us to kind of really move this from this abstract concept to one that's emotionally powerful. And I want to talk about that here in a second. When we talk, and again, the article on building the correlation model actually speaks to some of this, and so it will help connect some of the dots. But it's important that when you're doing this, it's easiest to start from the business objective and work backwards. When we say, well, here's what the business is trying to do, and now let's look at what are the different metrics and the different components of service deliveries that contribute to that, and then that allows us to connect it. But that isn't always possible. Sometimes we have to go ahead and we have a set of metrics that we're already committed to for whatever reason. And so you need to take great care in making sure that you're connecting that back up with that business value in some way. So let me give you just an example of a real-world experience that was actually mine of how this came into play. Many, many years ago, I was running technical operations for a healthcare organization. And when we were going through this process, one of the things that we were responsible for was we were acquiring a bunch of companies, and the ability to rapidly acquire and integrate, because of course we were buying these companies without any of their technology, and so we had to insert them into this operation that was basically in flight, and we had to do it in a way that while we were bringing on these big organizations and integrating them into what we were doing, that we didn't affect all of the operations we presently had underway. And so we put a lot of effort. Now, this is in the days before I knew how to spell ITIL. So we didn't know this had a name. But in effect, we were extremely focused on incidents caused by change. Now, this is a metric that many of you are probably very familiar with. But I will tell you, it's an abstract metric. In most organizations, incidents caused by change is something that's viewed as bad. Okay, fair enough. But it's abstract. It's hard to connect that with anything. We were very, very focused on this metric. But we weren't focused on it because of the metric. To us, it was that we were reducing incidents caused by change, which enabled us to more consistently and rapidly integrate these acquired companies. If we could not introduce change into our environment successfully and rapidly without causing failures in our other environments, then we were going to have to slow down these integrations, which frankly wasn't really an option, which meant we were going to get fired if we couldn't achieve this. But the point of it is that metric became extremely relevant to us and extremely powerful emotionally because it was tied to a very specific business driver, a very specific business objective. The other part of that is I remember having a conversation in conjunction with our CIO, with the CEO of the company, and when we were talking about what we were doing, she could now relate to it. If I had talked to her about incidents caused by change, and that was our metric, well, I mean, everyone can kind of understand that that's probably a bad thing. But when we talked about it in relation to our ability as a business to acquire and integrate these companies rapidly without causing problems in our current operations, that was something that was meaningful. And that, because it was meaningful at a business level, it charged our entire focus around it and made those metrics very powerful and very meaningful. So after we've connected this, and you've kind of done all this groundwork that we've talked about, a lot of the hard work is done, frankly. The only challenge is that right now what you have is a really good strategy. And you need to figure out how to move the strategy into the actual center of your management approach. But this can be a challenge. But before we even talk about the challenges and how to do that, we need to talk about why. And there's a very, very important reason. Most IT organizations, even today, in my estimation, are still managed through this kind of cowboy culture mentality. We don't always admit it, and a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, we've moved past that cowboy culture. But as we're in organizations, we see this as a very pervasive thing, and it is deeply rooted in organizational cultures today. And the challenge is what this really speaks to. I mean, we often talk about cowboy culture in the hero kind of mentality, but I'm really talking here in the context of the management approach. That is that if you go into most IT organizations, particularly at the management ranks and above, they're being led by instinct and intuition and not really by strategy and objective metrics. Now, there's two real problems with that. One of those problems is just that it's hard to do. As organizations get bigger and more complex, that intuition, that instinct is going to start failing because there's just too many moving parts to keep track of. But there's an even more important reason, in my opinion, and that is that type of management approach stands in sharp contrast to most other parts of an enterprise organization. If you look at the other business units and the other back office domains within a large enterprise organization, they are typically managed with a vast array of financial and operational metrics. They're not this kind of cowboy culture. They are pouring through reams of data that tell them how they're operating, how they're functioning. And so when these same business units now come to IT, and IT is operating off instinct and intuition and has very few metrics, at least meaningful metrics, that can really speak to how things are working and operating, it causes them to kind of look at IT with a slightly jaundiced eye. They bring to the table a degree of mistrust, and it permeates or propagates this idea that somehow IT is apart from the rest of the business. It isn't playing by the same rules. And so when we talk about this cowboy culture and why we need to break it down and bring metrics into the center of the management discipline and approach, it's really a key component to bringing IT closer to the business. We need to start operating in a more disciplined manner so that the business units have a lot more confidence in IT's ability to actually deliver all these services that have become absolutely critical to the business itself. So as we talk about moving metrics into the center of the organization, there's really two kind of stages of that we want to talk about, and we're already starting to run out of time. And as John mentioned, there's a lot of detail. We're going to try to cover some of it here, but there's a lot kind of more of the meat will be in the white paper, and I do hope that you find that of use. But the two primary stages that we talk about are execution and insertion. And I want to start with, as we talk about execution, there's certainly the technical execution. I'm hoping that goes without saying, and that you certainly need to have the technical disciplines that are necessary to actually capture the data and technically go get it and be able to massage it and all that kind of stuff. And in my experience, most IT organizations have the technical capabilities. And so execution kind of falls on deaf ears. No, we know how to do that. Well, the issue is that execution really is about trust. That when we talk about execution, when we talk about why metrics are typically not truly embedded into organizations, well, it really comes down to one thing, is that management doesn't trust the numbers. And if you cannot get your overall IT management teams to trust in the metrics, to trust in the numbers that they are producing, then everything we've talked about is meaningless because it's not going to go anywhere. So there's really three components that we're going to talk about when we talk about trust today. They are accuracy, clarity, and analysis. And we'll talk about them briefly. Accuracy, well, it should go without saying, but it can't, because we see this all the time. The data is simply not accurate. And there's a real significant reason for this. And that is that the cowboy culture that we've talked about has very little regard for maintaining accurate data. It kind of, it has this attitude that kind of says, get it done and document it much, much later. I find it fascinating that in so many organizations, the idea of, at the point of delivering, say, a level 1 type desktop support service, there's often resistance to having some form of technology to record detailed information about that incident right then and there. That people routinely resist documenting changes that are occurring in an emergency setting. That there is this constant state of it's this overhead burden. But the reality of it is that if you can get the point or get data capture to the point of creation, you will get accurate data. And you have to be willing to invest the resources, the control mechanisms, the quality checks, whatever it takes to ensure that accuracy. Because if you cannot get that data accurate, then nothing else is going to matter. And quite frankly, mandating that people, quote unquote, enter accurate data is not going to cut it. It just is not going to happen. You have to embed this into the organization as a fundamental principle. The second thing is really clarity. Now, clarity is really understanding that the meaning and interpretation of every metric has to be readily apparent to the consumer of that data. If they cannot look at that data and kind of intuitively understand what it's telling them, then they're not going to trust it. And if they can't rely on it being consistently interpreted not only by themselves but by others that they are sharing this with, it's going to undermine the fundamental trust in the entire metric strategy. I was actually just in a meeting the other day, and the poor guys presenting it had this whole stack of metrics, slides showing different data points, and even they got confused. This thing was so messed up and complex that they were halfway talking through this, and they stopped and said, oh, well, I'm not sure if that's what that means. It might mean this, and oh, hey, do you know what that means? And I'm sitting here on the phone kind of cringing that these guys are not creating any trust in these metrics, and so therefore, how is anyone ever going to take it seriously? But this speaks to one of the real challenges when we talk about clarity, and that is that if you're the one producing the metrics or responsible for managing the metrics, you're too close to it. You know what it means. You know what it's supposed to say. So therefore, you know how to interpret it. So you need to get this out of your realm and into the hands of the consumers in a way. You can't just throw it out there and say, hey, if this doesn't make sense to you, get back to me. You need to go out, whether you use focus groups or discussion forums or just go interview consumers of the data and say, what does this metric mean to you? Do you know how to interpret this? And then go to the next consumer of that same data and see if they have the same interpretation. You have to create this objectivity, and you need to do it on a continual basis. That's the other challenge, is that as the business evolves, if your metrics don't change with them, then you run the risk of them, what was once clear becomes unclear because something around it has changed. So I need to kind of keep going through this. The last one is analysis. And sometimes people can get confused about this, is that when we talk about execution, this is a continual investment. You need a team, or at least a small group of people, maybe part-time, whose job is to kind of to be the stewards of the metrics data. And part of their role has to be a form of analysis. And the reason is that you need to give your management teams a reference point, some help in where to focus their attention. Because if you don't, it can get overwhelming, right? A well-run IT organization could have literally hundreds of metrics sitting out there, and being able to identify where you've got gaps or where you have indicators, it can get daunting. And so our objective here is to create trust by ensuring that the metrics that are being produced are enabling rapid assessment, decision-making, and consistency of action. So providing a small layer of analysis can be a key to this process. There's really two types. I'm not going to spend much time on them right now. One is diagnostic, and the other is prescriptive. Fundamentally, diagnostic is about identifying trends and causal relationships between metrics through these correlation models. Prescriptive simply does that and takes it one step further, which provides some recommendations for remedial action. In either case, the objective is to enable your management team to rapidly assess IT performance in the context of these metrics, and to make decisions based on them that are accurate and well-intended, or well-targeted, I should say, and that those actions are consistent. So if you do not provide this analysis, I can almost guarantee you then that some people will act on them, some people will drink the Kool-Aid and will be all over it, and other teams will not, and it's going to create inconsistency. So a small investment in providing a layer of continual analysis on those metrics as a service to your management team will pay itself off in spades. At this point now, we've kind of done all the groundwork. You've got all the design work done. You've gone through execution where you've laid in the necessary trust that people will have enough faith. And now it's that final, last, critical step of actually inserting this whole approach, this whole idea of a metric strategy deep into the day-to-day activities and management structures of the organization. Now, this should be automatic. If all this has gone well, you will frankly find that most management is just chomping at the bit for this data, that they are looking to engage with it because they've been dying for it, because they've been flying blind. And despite the statements that there's intuition and instinct, they all want data. Right now, they still may need to learn how to use it, but they want the data. So to some degree, this is going to become automatic, but you need to be deliberate about it, because if you don't, you can lose control or it can get used incorrectly. So when we talk about inserting metrics into the core of your management approach, your management discipline, there's really three primary things that we're talking about. The first is accountability. Now, this is exactly what it sounds like, that the IT leadership team at all levels has to be willing to hold themselves and their teams accountable based on the metrics. That goes back to why establishing trust in the data is so key. But this accountability is where it all starts and ends. There's no silver bullet here, though. This is really simply nothing more than a decision. So if you're the IT leader, the big IT leader, you need to make this decision, and you need to make it hard, very visibly, very publicly, that this isn't, and you have to do this after the groundwork has been laid. But you need to go into this whole process with an understanding that this is what's going to be required. The mantra has to become, show me the data, show me the data. Right? This is the battle you have to win, that the entire decision-making framework for the IT organization has to start centering around holding people accountable to the data that is being produced. So if you're not the IT leader, this is where you need to start, because this whole process is frankly not going to produce anything if metrics are not used as the primary means to drive accountability. And so we're going to talk about here in a second with performance targets and exactly how those tie together, but I need to make this point very, very clearly. If you cannot get the management team to be willing to use those metrics as the primary foundational mechanism and framework for holding people accountable, then stop until you get that done. And like I said, there's no secret sauce. They simply have to make that decision to be willing to back it. Now, part of that, though, and part of how you can make that easier is the use of performance targets. And I can hear the groans kind of coming from across the internet. Well, yeah, performance targets. Everyone has performance targets. Well, that's kind of true, but the problem really is that people don't really use performance targets correctly or effectively in most cases. And that's because they just kind of sit out there, and they don't necessarily have meaning. And the reason is they end up in one of two flavors that we'll talk about here in a second. But for performance targets to be effective, you really need 3 of them for each metric. The first is what we call the minimum performance expectation. And this isn't exactly the same as a baseline. A lot of times people will go and just trend something out, and you might use a baseline to set your minimum performance expectation. But the key here is that your minimum performance expectation has to be achievable at the starting point. And the reason is you're going to use it as a foundation to drive accountability. When someone fails to meet the minimum performance expectation for any given metric, the reaction from management needs to be severe and swift. This is the biggest tool that you will have at the beginning of this process to make people understand that things are different this time. That when that metric is not met, it is not shoot, well, that was rough. No, there are severe consequences for not meeting that metric, that minimum performance, because that is exactly what it means. This is the lowest bar. And so generally speaking, you don't want this, particularly at the beginning, to be any kind of a stretch. Unless you have really acute service performance problems right now, you want this to be attainable, because otherwise you're going to be beating your people up constantly. And it's going to, and the reality of it is you probably aren't going to be willing to do that, and which means it's going to completely deflate its value. So you need to set those, but then they need to be a hard line in the sand. But then how do you actually use metrics as a tool to improve? Well, the other challenge we see is that people set their performance targets as like these 5-year goals. We call those strategic improvement targets, and those are very important and valuable to set your long-term direction. But if that's all you have, it's really hard to stay motivated when I'm looking out at something that I can't achieve anytime in the near future. So we're really focused on setting those immediate performance targets in a 12 or 18-month window, something that is readily achievable, and I can track my performance against it in a short lifespan. I can see that I'm moving towards it, and I'm on track or not on track to achieve it. And if you do have acute performance issues, you might set 3-month or 6-month performance targets as constant steps, where our goal 3 months from now is to move this metric from this to this in correlation with these other metrics to whatever we're looking at, that we have to do that, because that's what's going to actually drive behavioral change. If I can see where I'm at, I know my basement is, I know I cannot fall below that number, and so we're going to do everything we need to do that. And then my real goals are the next 3, 6, 12 months to move to this point, and management is holding us accountable for not only achieving that minimum, but progressing towards that midterm or that immediate goal. It will allow us to start focusing our behavior in a way that we create action and we actually achieve some results. The last part of this is that we need to make sure that we recognize that performance targets should not be static. They should not be something that we set once and leave. That as your teams demonstrate that they are achieving that immediate performance goal consistently, well, guess what? That now becomes your new minimum performance expectation, and you reset your immediate goals for the next 6 to 12 months out as you continue your march towards that strategic goal. So what are your 3 performance targets for every metric, or maybe a cocktail of metrics? You may bunch them together to look at them more holistically. But whatever you're doing, you've got to use these. These are probably your most important tool for actually driving behavioral change. The last key thing that you need to do to get metrics into the core of how you operate from a management discipline standpoint is to make it personal. Most everything we've talked about up to this point, we've been talking kind of big picture. IT performance, critical stuff. But it's kind of like the saying in politics that all politics is local. Well, all metrics are really local. And it is very challenging for any duration of time for any given manager or IT associate to care about a metric that doesn't directly relate to their own performance. So we need to move our metrics from this big picture into the personal realm by allowing each person and each team to evaluate IT performance from their own unique perspective, for them to understand how their own performance elements are contributing or taking away from the overall IT performance, but allow me to focus on what is actually impacting me or what I can actually affect. And so whether it's dashboards or specialized application consoles or good old-fashioned reports, you need to take great care in enabling that you don't lose sight of the fact that you need to provide a mechanism for people to see this metrics model, to see all this correlation, to see the tie-back to IT performance from their personal perspective. And if you can do that in conjunction with these other things, that creates a tremendous amount of personal drive or personal energy to create action and will cause behavioral change on an individual level. So as we kind of wrap this up, I want to kind of go back to the core point here that we started this with, is that we need to make sure that your metric strategy is more than a mere decoration on the wall. If we ask an organization, do you want a passive or active metrics approach or strategy, they will almost always say they want it active. But the reality is that in most cases what we see is that it is, in fact, very passive. It's a set of numbers that we throw up on the wall as a way to kind of communicate to the world how we see ourselves. But they're not actually being used as tools to truly monitor and improve IT performance. But if you're willing to move beyond that kind of passive approach and create a truly active metrics strategy, and you go through the hard work of creating context through correlation, of understanding how those metrics correlate with one another, if you are aware of and create emotional connections with these metrics, they become alive and they get infused with an energy, that you tie everything back to IT performance, so that everything that the IT organization is doing and is measuring can be communicated in relation to how it provides value to the business. And that you make the big investment and devote the energy necessary to create trust through the execution of this process and ensuring that people can rely on that data. And then finally, make the investments to insert that into management. Then I think what you'll find is a very different perspective on how metrics are viewed and consumed within an IT organization. And you'll find that, in truth, it's the only way that you will truly create a better IT organization. So with that, we're going to wrap this up. I know we've got just a few minutes left for any questions I might have. We have on the screen a little bit of information about Twitter, blog, our website, where we do post a lot of our content that you can gain access to, and then just, I guess, our really quick commercial, just in case you don't know what we do. Our entire focus as CastlePointe is to help IT leaders transform their organizations through a set of services and solutions focused around helping with organizational adoption, metrics and measurements, change leadership development, and program execution. And if you do have any needs in those areas, we'd of course love to talk with you. So John, with that, I will kick it back to you and see if we have any questions.
Okay, so if people have questions on the left-hand side, please feel free to type them in and hit enter, and you'll see them there. You had mentioned, we have one or two questions. You had mentioned that a separate group owns the metrics to basically be looking at them and analyzing them. Where should this group be in the organization?
So I don't know that I have a huge opinion as to where. I will say this. I think there's a difference between the technical side of metrics. So you will often see a group that is associated with the tool management team that may be responsible for the technical management and implementation of metrics or reports. That's fine. What I'm really speaking to here is that you need a group of people who are the stewards of the data, and they need to be able to look at it holistically. A lot of times we'll see the owners of the data becoming responsible for their individual metric, and that is going to make it very difficult to create correlation and to kind of have that big picture view of where it all comes together. So you need, it could be one person, it could be one part-time person in a small enough organization, but someone who is responsible for being the steward of that entire metrics model, that entire metrics strategy, and then working with whoever to actually cause it to be implemented. And that implementation team could be outsourced. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of doing that. So where it is isn't as important as making sure that there is someone that is their focus. And then I guess the last part maybe to answer that question is they do need to be somewhat independent from any one operational team. So either a staff position to the CIO or maybe some kind of a governance team, something like that, so they don't get stuck into being too focused on one area.
And sort of a follow-on question to that is the people who own the metrics, should they also own the knowledge management process?
Very interesting question. I think that they're clearly very related, but not necessarily one and the same. Just generally speaking, I'm not a huge believer in any hard and fast rules of ownership, but clearly knowledge and metrics are very closely tied together. That said, I think that you can certainly have them separated and have it function effectively, because the metrics is looking at the composite data and knowledge is kind of the underlying component. Now, all that said, knowledge, a true service knowledge management system is all-encompassing. It owns all pieces of information and knowledge that the IT organization is required the organization requires to operate, and that is clearly going to include your metrics. And metrics should be a linchpin of not only determining where the IT organization is going, but also what knowledge is missing or lacking and we need to go collect. So whether you structure them together or not, they're clearly very related.
There have been some questions also in terms of the metrics correlation model that you mentioned in the article. So just to let people know, it's located on our website, which is castlepointe.com. You can see the website on there. And basically, it's under the category, if you look ideas and insights, you go under there, it's under measuring IT effectiveness. That's where you can find the article.
And when we send out a link for the white paper, which will probably be early next week, we'll go ahead and include a link to the correlation model article as well.
We had one other question back to your very first comment, and it wasn't a flame about first call resolution not necessarily being a great metric. If that's not a great metric, what is the right metric, or what is the metric you would use in conjunction with that?
Oh, fine. Throw me under the bus on that one. So first of all, it's not that I dislike FCR. I think FCR, the elements of focusing on customer service and focusing on bringing service, that the resolution of an incident as close to the customer as possible, are really good things. My issue with FCR is that it's very imprecise. And so the biggest issue is that you just need to be able to see it in light of everything else, particularly problem management. But I think there's a lot of things. I mean, I'm always very interested in customer satisfaction from a service desk perspective. Service desk, unlike maybe some of the other areas, it's really all about the perception that the customer has of their interaction with that service desk. And so measuring customer satisfaction both at the time of delivery, which can be somewhat skewed, and then a little bit more scientifically, I think is probably one of the greatest indicators of a service desk's ability to perform from a customer sat standpoint or service standpoint. It doesn't always speak to efficiency, and there's some other metrics that we probably don't have time to get into right now, but I hope that answers the question.
Well, with that, we're basically out of time, so I want to thank everyone for joining today. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, and we'll see you again in a month. Thank you.